moving to impeach. What top Democrats and some Republicans are saying about trying to remove President Donald Trump from office before his term ends next week. Ready to take over. The president-elect reveals his nominee to be director of the CIA. Polarized America. A leading Catholic voice weighs in on where we are as a nation. And a moral obligation. Pope Francis explains whether he thinks the faithful should take the coronavirus vaccine. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, January 11th, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Democrats on Capitol Hill move closer to impeaching President Donald Trump. He will likely face one charge, incitement of insurrection. This comes after the deadly riot at the U.S. Capitol last week carried out by some of the president's supporters. Correspondent Mark Irons has the latest now on Capitol Hill. Mark?
Tracy, since the storming of the Capitol, Democrats and even some Republicans have demanded consequences for President Trump. Now, today, Republicans blocked the passage of a resolution calling on the vice president to invoke the 25th Amendment, which would declare the president unfit to serve. But House Democrats already have enough votes to impeach the president.
With 9 days left in his term, Democrats continue a push to remove President Trump from office.
The Republican leadership, including the vice president, should meet with the president and tell him he has to resign.
Today on the House floor, a resolution asking Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment.
To declare President Donald J. Trump incapable of executing the duties of his office and to immediately exercise powers as acting president.
But Republicans pushed back.
I object.
Objection is heard.
The vice president hasn't given any indication he will actually invoke the 25th to remove the president from office. In a statement, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, "As our next step, we will move forward with bringing impeachment legislation to the floor. The president's threat to America is urgent, and so too will be our action." The impeachment bill will reference the president's statements about his election defeat, his attempt to pressure Georgia officials to find him more votes, and his urging on supporters before they stormed the U.S. Capitol last week.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness.
Democrats aren't the only ones critical of the president. Republican Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey says President Trump could face criminal liability after the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. He's calling on the president to resign.
The best way to get this person in the rearview mirror for us, that could happen immediately. I'm not optimistic it will, but I do think that would be the best way forward.
And Republican Senator Ben Sasse said lies have consequences. This violence was the inevitable and ugly outcome of the president's addiction to constantly stoking division.
Some Republicans say impeachment would only further divide the country. And as the charge to impeach the president moves through the House for a second time, the Senate is in recess. And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says an impeachment trial would not even be able to begin until the day before President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. At the Capitol, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
With 9 days left in office, President Donald Trump's ability to communicate on social media has been largely silenced. First Lady Melania Trump says she is disappointed and disheartened by the deadly riot at the Capitol and asks for healing grace and peace for the country. Also, President-elect Joe Biden names his CIA director. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. Tonight, President Donald Trump's social media communication options are very limited. His 80 million plus followers on Twitter can no longer view his account.
Corporate repercussions in the wake of last Wednesday's violence at the U.S. Capitol. President Donald Trump booted off most mainstream social media platforms, and Amazon kicked Parler off its web hosting service early today. The president of the Computer and Communication Industry Association believes social media companies are simply exercising their own speech rights.
Free speech isn't speech free from consequences. It means speech free from government consequences. And here it's a government speaker who is the actor.
First Lady Melania Trump is communicating on the White House blog, writing, "I am disappointed and disheartened with what happened last week. This time is solely about healing our country and its citizens. Violence is never acceptable."
565758.
Meantime, video released by the Defense Department shows National Guard troops arriving in Washington, D.C. The mission provides support for the upcoming presidential inauguration. This as the National Park Service is shutting down the Washington Monument until January 24th. And flags fly at half-staff across the nation, honoring Capitol Hill and all police officers. Meanwhile, President-elect Joe Biden named another key nominee today.
He knows how to lead, and to lead with integrity.
He picked former Ambassador Bill Burns to lead the CIA.
Good intelligence is the first line of defense for America.
Also this afternoon, the president-elect received his second COVID-19 vaccination.
For President Donald Trump, the focus now shifts back to immigration. Tomorrow he heads to Texas. The White House says he'll mark the completion of more than 400 miles of border wall. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Robert George McCormick, professor of jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, joins me now on Skype. Robbie, welcome back. Always so good to have you on. Tell me, what are your thoughts on what we as a nation saw and experienced last week?
This is a difficult period for us as a people. We're facing some very serious challenges. And there are some questions that need to be answered about what happened on January 6th. But I believe we can come through this a renewed and refreshed people. And I think the way we do that is by remembering our first principles, going back to the foundational principles of the American Republic, the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, rooted as they are in the broader biblical tradition. The Judeo-Christian tradition, the tradition that begins in the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible with the proposition that human beings are made in the very image and likeness of God and therefore are precious. And that's why human life is precious. That's why justice is important. That's why respect for others is important. And we need to remember those ideals at this time as we think back on what happened on January 6th and on the context of what happened and go forward resolving that we're going to do better.
Absolutely. I know you posted something on your Twitter about naming and honoring people who disagree with you on matters that are important to you. As we heard Owen mention in his report, President Trump has been banned from Twitter, and others are claiming that those with conservative voices are being silenced on social media. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm worried about that kind of tech censorship. The tech platforms have enormous power. They do provide the means of communication now for millions upon millions of people. This is how we interact with each other. It's the equivalent of the public square in the old days, or even the village green in the old days. And it's important for all voices to be heard. So I'm concerned about it. I'm also concerned about the oligarchic aspect of it, that you have a few very powerful people who are making decisions that affect everybody else. Now, there are limitations on speech. There are sorts of speech, forms of speech that are not legally protected, not protected by the First Amendment. Incitement to violence is one of them. Intimidation is one of them. Obscenity is one of them. False advertising, conspiracy. So not all speech is protected. But political speech is protected. And it's protected for those we disagree with as much as those we agree with. And I don't think it's a good answer simply to say that, well, these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, are private companies, and therefore we have no legitimate concern as the public in how they conduct their affairs or who they exclude or who they include or what sorts of restraints they put on speech. No, that's not realistic. These companies play a very important role in the public. They benefit very much from public resources, and so they're going to have to be accountable. I do think we need to demand that basic principles of free speech be respected on the big platforms.
And Robbie, before I let you go, can you maybe just give some advice or share some thoughts on how we can move forward in healing, especially for Catholics?
Well, yes. First, I think that it's important that President Trump take responsibility and be held accountable for actions that I believe were reckless. He crossed the line when he led the public to believe, or his supporters to believe, including the crowd that he called to come to Washington to believe, that Vice President Pence had it within his power to decide which slate of electors to recognize coming out of the states where he was contesting the vote. As Vice President Pence himself recognized, he had no such authority. It would have been a gross act of constitutional violence against Constitution, really, for the Vice President to have exercised the power that the President was demanding that he exercise. And then the President claimed that the Vice President's refusal to perform an unconstitutional act constituted a kind of betrayal. That helped to whip the crowd up into a frenzy. Now, not everybody in the crowd, only a minority of people then assaulted the Capitol building and produced that outrageous and appalling scene that we witnessed on January 6th. But some people did, and I think the president has to take responsibility for that and be accountable for that. We can debate exactly how that accountability ought to be handled. But I don't think we can pretend that the president doesn't have responsibility here. Now, at the same time, we have to understand that there's a background to all of this, and we don't want to tolerate any hypocrisy here. There has been violence in our streets. There has been lawlessness. There's been arson assaults on a federal building in Portland, Oregon, a courthouse. And some folks who are critical of the president said nothing, or even did worse than say nothing when that violence happened. So let's end the hypocrisy. Let's tell the truth on both sides. Let's hold accountable everybody who has participated through the summer and into January 6th and on January 6th in producing the appalling result that we saw.
Well said, and we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much, Robbie. We always appreciate your perspective.
Thank you, Tracy. My pleasure.
Coming up, what Pope Francis is saying about last week's violence in the nation's capital. A plane in Indonesia disappeared after taking off over the weekend and nosedived into waters off of Jakarta with 69 people on board. Navy divers recovered parts of the Boeing 737, but no survivors. The plane went down in heavy rain on Saturday, and dozens of helicopters and ships have been searching the area since yesterday. The Prime Minister of Britain is getting a close-up look at how vaccinations are going in southern England. Boris Johnson spoke to nurses and people getting vaccinated at a center in Bristol earlier today. Even though the vaccine is being rolled out, he warned people to continue to follow government restrictions. China is denying that it imposes birth control on Muslim minorities after the Chinese embassy in Washington tweeted that it freed Uyghur women from being, quote, baby-making machines. Chinese officials tell reporters that birth control decisions were made of the women's own free will. They also deny forcing the Muslim women to get abortions. But last summer, an investigation by the Associated Press found that the communist government was forcing birth control measures on ethnic minorities. For the first time in more than 50 years, Franciscan friars celebrate a Mass at the site where John the Baptist baptized Jesus Christ. Father Francesco Patton led the Mass. It was celebrated at the St. John the Baptist Chapel in the West Bank. The chapel was cleared of landmines left over from the 1967 war between Israel and Jordan. Several churches were built in the area, some dating back to the 4th century. Pope Francis has changed canon law to allow women to serve as lectors and altar servers. The measure now references laypersons of suitable age rather than laymen. The Holy Father brought up the possibility of making the change during the Synod on the Amazon in 2019. Pope Francis also says that it is a moral obligation to take the coronavirus vaccine. In a sit-down interview on Italian television yesterday, the Holy Father said those who do not receive the vaccine are playing with their own lives and the lives of others. Joining us now with more details is EWTN News Rome correspondent Colin Flynn. Colin, good to see you. So, What more did Pope Francis say about receiving the vaccine?
Good evening, Tracy. Well, in a TV interview last night here in Italy, Pope Francis said it was everyone's ethical duty to take the COVID-19 vaccine and that he was in line to receive it as early as this coming week. In the interview, Pope Francis said it was an ethical choice because you're gambling with your own health, with your life, but also you're gambling with the lives of others. The Pope has also, of course, Tracy, on a number of occasions said that everything must be done to ensure the vaccine is available to all, not just those living in wealthy and first world countries. Now, in this interview, he spoke about a memory from his childhood in Argentina when they had the polio epidemic, and he recalled many children being left paralyzed from it, and he talked about how everyone was desperately awaiting a vaccine. So he went on to say that he would be getting the COVID-19 vaccine and that it must be done. Pope Francis, of course, is 84 years of age, and when he lived in Argentina, he had part of one of his lungs removed after suffering an illness, which puts him now in a very vulnerable category. In fact, Vatican News over the weekend, Tracy, reported that the Pope's doctor, Fabrizio Soccorsi, had died due to complications from COVID-19. He was in hospital being treated for cancer, and he was 78 years of age.
I also understand Pope Francis mentioned the political unrest that we're experiencing here in the United States. What exactly did he say about that?
Well, Tracy, when he was asked about the protesters who stormed Capitol Hill, Pope Francis said that he was astonished. He said that these people took a path against the community, against democracy, and against the common good. He also condemned the violence in his Sunday address after the Angelus, saying, "I reiterate that violence is always self-destructive. Nothing is gained by violence and so much is lost." And in his TV interview, he said he was glad what happened was exposed. Quote, "I thank God this broke out and we can all see it well because this can be remedied, right?" End quote. Finally, he said that after what happened at Capitol Hill, it was now time for healing.
Colin, before I let you go, any other takeaways from the interview?
Yes, Tracy, he talked about abortion and said that this wasn't just a religious issue, but this was a human issue. In the interview, he said the problem was pre-religious. It is a problem of human ethics. He urged people to ask themselves this question: is it right to delete a human life to solve a problem? Any problem? No. It's not right, is what he said. He went on to say that we need to abandon the throwaway culture of today and be more welcoming to children, to migrants, to the elderly, to those most in need. He said we should replace the word I with the word us. Tracy?
Okay, Colin Flynn, thank you so much for that report.
Thank you, Tracy.
Pope Francis reminds the faithful that God will always meet us where we are.
La vicinanza e lo stile di Dio nei nostri confronti.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says Christ spent most of his life on earth doing ordinary things and not standing out. It's a reminder of the greatness of daily life. On the feast of our Lord's baptism, Pope Francis also asked the faithful to find out and celebrate on their own baptismal anniversary. Up next, analysis of what the pro-life battle will look like under a Joe Biden administration. The lawyer for a woman due to be executed tomorrow says her client should be granted clemency. Lisa Montgomery was convicted of killing a 23-year-old pregnant woman and stealing her unborn baby back in 2007. Her attorney says, quote, she has expressed deep and severe remorse from the moment of her arrest. The incoming chair of the U.S. Bishops' Doctrine Committee says the death penalty is just part of the so-called throwaway culture. Bishop Daniel Flores discussed the church's opposition to capital punishment in an online forum, saying, quote, the state cannot and should not exercise the power to execute. Pro-lifers are also keeping an eye on Capitol Hill as last week's wins for Democrats in Georgia set up potential abortion funding battles in the Senate. Matt Hadro, senior D.C. correspondent at Catholic News Agency, joins me now to talk about the road ahead. Matt, welcome back. Always great to see you. So what's the biggest pro-life concern as we look ahead to the new Congress and this new political landscape?
The biggest concern far and away is public funding of abortions in healthcare. So this most notably takes the form of the Hyde Amendment, which protects against taxpayer funding of elective abortions in Medicaid. And Democrats have been very vocal in recent years that they want to see Hyde repealed. We have House Democratic leadership saying that they intend to repeal the policy this year. President-elect Joe Biden has said that he would support its repeal. And so, this is something that pro-life groups are watching very closely.
Matt, how likely is it, though, that the Hyde Amendment would be repealed, and which senators would be key players?
So Democrats have a clear majority in the House, but they have a very, very narrow majority in the Senate. And so their margin for error for any policy priority is very small. There's a handful of senators that could possibly vote either way on this issue. Most notable is Joe Manchin, moderate Democrat from West Virginia. And he's voted pro-life in the past, and he's come out in support of Hyde. He said that he supports any attempt to repeal it. There's a couple of Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine, who have voted pro-abortion in the past, so they could possibly join Democrats on this. But pro-life groups, depending on who you talk to, they're not sold on Joe Manchin's reliability as a pro-life vote. So he's going to be especially someone to watch on this.
If the Hyde Amendment is not outright repealed, how else may we see it weakened?
So yeah, another concern of pro-life groups is that if the amendment isn't repealed, it could simply be marginalized. So there could be new funding streams created through legislation in this Congress. We could see this very soon in a COVID relief bill, for instance. If that does not include specific pro-life language, it could result in funding of abortions, abortion coverage, or pro-abortion groups like Planned Parenthood. That's what pro-life groups are warning. If there's a healthcare bill that comes along this Congress that could create perhaps a public option, we could be seeing some publicly funded health plans with abortion coverage and without explicit pro-life language. So this is something that pro-life groups are really watching for this year.
Matt, before I let you go, what else is on your radar? What else are you keeping an eye on?
One other thing to keep an eye on is the appropriations process. So every year Congress has to pass bills funding the government. And what some Senate Democrats have tried to do in recent years is at the last minute insert pro-abortion provisions into must-pass spending bills. Republicans had the majority in the Senate, so those pro-abortion provisions didn't survive. But now that Democrats have the majority, we could see efforts like this again.
Okay, we'll leave it right there. Matt Hadro, senior D.C. correspondent at Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much, Matt. And finally tonight, hundreds of thousands of the faithful in the Philippines gathered over the weekend to celebrate one of the most important feast days in the country. The faithful defied coronavirus restrictions to pay homage on the Feast of the Black Nazarene in Manila. Police enforced social distancing protocols, and instead of venerating the statue, the faithful waved handkerchiefs at it. Many miracles have been attributed to the centuries-old statue. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.